Happy Tuesday. It's Sabine Gideon, CEO of Gideon Enterprises, an executive search and leadership development firm. And I am here with you this week with the leadership lesson of the week. And today we're going to be talking about inclusive leadership in action. So as we know, in the last couple of years, there's pretty much been a serious upheaval in terms of how the workplace works and how it operates, led by many different factors that we've all experienced or that have had some impact on all of us. But in the time that we're in, many senior leaders and HR executives, they're at a place where they are really examining their organization's DEI initiatives, they're examining the wellness initiatives, they're examining the training development, leadership development initiatives that they have in their organizations to meet the demands of this time. And as we all know, right, when it comes to reinvention or pivoting or engaging in any major change initiatives within an organization, it has to start at the top. It has to start with leadership. And so today I want to speak to what is inclusive leadership and how does it actually show up. On this week's episode of the She Leads Now podcast, I go in depth a little bit more about the 6 characteristics of inclusive leadership and how to adopt them. But for the purpose of this video, we're just going to talk high level of what inclusive leadership is and then 5 ways to put it in practice. So as far as inclusive leadership goes, it is reflected or demonstrated by valuing team members. It initiates diverse perspectives and it creates an atmosphere where people feel that their opinions are valued and that their contributions to the organization is actually relevant, right? Like they can see how what they do actually impacts the customer, impacts the product, or impacts the mission being able to move forward. When we think about it in the perspective of workplace culture, inclusive leadership is really critical to company growth. It's not just a nice to have or nice to talk about. And it's not just something that's philosophical, but it's something that is real and it's something that is needed. And it is what's going to differentiate organizations when it comes to people wanting to work there, wanting to stay there, wanting to purchase from them, wanting to partner with them. And so that's inclusive leadership when you look at it from a cultural perspective. But when you look at the individuals who are driving inclusive leadership, so the inclusive leaders, they're individuals who are aware of their own bias. And not only that, they're active and they're intentional about seeking out or considering different perspectives to help inform their decisions and to ensure that they are creating a collaborative environment around them. And it also means that as an inclusive leader, they're making sure that their teams are treated equitably, that their employees feel a sense of belonging and value, and that they actually have the resources that they need to be successful and to reach their full potential. So as we look at that holistically, from the individual leader who is inclusive to the organization that embodies an inclusive environment or inclusive culture, it really opens up organizations to a wider variety of viewpoints, and it fosters this work environment that is more empathetic. And that is really the foundation of building an inclusive culture, is really empathy. And again, empathy starts with the leader. And so if that's not a characteristic that is strong for you right now, and you do have a genuine desire to build more inclusivity in the way that you approach life, the way that you approach business, and the way that you approach growing your teams, start with empathy. So what are the 5 acts of inclusive leadership, right? So you got a baseline of what it is, how it shows up, what it looks like, but what do you do? How do you show up? And how do you reflect that in your day-to-day? And so first one up is deepen your self-awareness. And we can never do enough self-work. At the end of the day, our teams, our departments, whatever it is that we touch is a reflection of us. And therefore, if we're not sure of our own bias, if we're not sure about our own strengths, our own weaknesses, if we don't have clarity on us, it's harder for us to be able to communicate and drive a vision to others. And so first things first is check yourself, right? Check yourself, check your ego at the door, do that assessment, gain feedback from others, And then with that, as you become more self-aware, right, that builds confidence and that builds your ability to be able to communicate to people, this is who I am, and then also create space for them to communicate who they are and what matters to them. The second step, once you've gained your own self-awareness, is to foster social awareness. And so that's really the currency of dialogue and our relationships with other people. That's when you move past, okay, who am I? What do I believe? What are my values? What are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? To start to look at those things in those around you. And then using that information, right, to build that culture of inclusion. Number three is around revealing the blind spots. We know based on the last couple of years and really decades, right, that inequality exists. And so part of your responsibility as an inclusive leader is to, one, be honest, right? It's not an even playing field. And no matter how woke or employee friendly your organization is, the truth is all organizations and all individuals within organizations aren't operating on the same playing field. And so as the leader, as the inclusive leader, this is your opportunity to be intentional about creating opportunities that are accessible to all of your employees. Number four is listening to understand. And this is where curiosity comes into place, right? As an inclusive leader, you have to be curious. That is your superpower. The moment you start to think that everything because you've read all the books or you've listened to some podcasts or you've watched some webinars, right? And the moment that you've made the decision or the assumption that you know everything about every single culture and what everyone brings to the table is the minute you lose your biggest weapon, your biggest superpower. And so really taking listening to that next level. So beyond just active listening, right? Asking questions, getting curious about individuals, really wanting to understand what drives them, what motivates them, listening to the why behind the why, even if they're just sharing a challenge that they're having with a project or a challenge that they're having with someone else, that'll give you some insight and give you some data, if you will, for how to approach this person or perhaps how this person thinks or perceives information, which will again give you a better positioning as their leader to help guide them in the way that makes the most sense for them. And then the last one is really leading with courage and vulnerability. And so inclusive leaders, they are courageous and they are vulnerable. Courage is always put out there like it is this thing like you have no fear, when in fact, courage is acting in the face of fear. And so this is the self-reflection piece of being able to identify the areas where you may have some gaps, you have limitations, and being vulnerable and humble enough to ask questions, to seek out feedback, to let others challenge you in your way of thinking, and as well as creating space for you to challenge others. So those are the five acts or the five ways to actually demonstrate inclusive leadership. There's so much content that I could share here, but at the end of the day, we know that any form of change does not happen overnight. And that includes becoming an inclusive leader and or cultivating an inclusive culture. So what's next? How do you move forward? This is where as a leader, right, you have to challenge yourself. You have to really ask yourself, put that mirror up and ask yourself, am I as inclusive as I need to be personally? And how is that being reflected back in my organization if I am or if I'm not? Leaders at the end of the day, that we need to be intentional, we need to be consistent and committed to investing the time and the financial resources that are needed to transform or to reinvent ourselves and our organizations to the space. We know ROIs of doing this work for us personally and within our organizations reflect back in increase in employee engagement and retention, diversity of thought, more creative opportunities, and of course, the ability to innovate and gain a competitive advantage in the marketplace. And so that's what I have for you today around inclusive leadership in action. Let me know in the comments if any of this resonated with you, how you're showing up, what changes that you're making either personally or within your organization. And again, please be sure to tune in this week for the She Leads Now podcast to hear about the characteristics of inclusive leadership. With that, I will see you next week. Have a great rest of the day. Take care.